Hey, this is Cold Turkey, and welcome to part 8 of my 9-part commentary series on old school Doctor Who. And in part 8, we're going to be talking about the 7th Doctor. Dun dun dun! 7th Doctor had seasons 24, 25, and 26, September 1987 to December 1989. The 7th Doctor is the last Doctor of old school Doctor Who. We started in the 60s, early 60s, and then we ended in the late 80s. We had a long stint, almost 30 years, not quite, but almost, and the 7th Doctor is the capstone of old school Doctor Who. Now, from a rating standpoint, we got to kind of look at it, what was going on. Remember, the show had some really big issues with the 6th Doctor, and honestly, the ratings were still just as bad. And that's one of the reasons that at the end of the 7th Doctor's 3-year stint, the BBC had finally decided, you know what, it's it, that's it, it's over, we're gonna stop Doctor Who. So this is kind of the end of old school Doctor Who. And even though the ratings were still bad, you got to kind of look at the 7th Doctor and say, well, you know, Sylvester McCoy is an actor. He's the actor who portrayed the 7th Doctor. I think he did a pretty good job overall. But a lot of the problems that plagued the 6th Doctor are still present within the 7th Doctor. A lot of the scripts are just poorly written. The storylines are bad. The dialogue is bad. The costumes are bad. Special effects are bad. It just seems like they're still in the same rut for the most part. And when I say for the most part, I think if you compare the 6th Doctor to the 7th Doctor, especially the last 2 seasons of the 7th Doctor, things are getting better. I think if you look at just the last 2 seasons of the 7th Doctor, because the first season of the 7th Doctor makes me want to cry. It's so bad. But if you just look at the last 2 seasons, every now and again, you see a glimmer of hope. You see something that isn't horrible. And you think, wow, you know what? Doctor Who can maybe come back. Maybe you can get out of this, because you're watching this at the time and you're thinking, come on, you know, we don't want Doctor Who to get canceled. We want it to keep going, but it did. So who is the 7th Doctor? The 7th Doctor very much is akin to the 1st Doctor. He's a bit older. He has a vast amount of knowledge. One of the interesting things they went with the 7th Doctor is it seems like a lot of past memories in the Doctor's brain were unlocked for maybe the first time, but more than likely not, with the 7th Doctor. The 7th Doctor was smarter than all the other Doctors, possibly with the exception of the 1st Doctor. He knows more. He remembers more. There's these universe-defining things going on, and the 7th Doctor has the key, has sort of this grasp of what's going on, and in a lot of ways, they really try to up the ante when it comes to the opponents of the 7th Doctor. The 7th Doctor, yeah, he fights Cybermen, fights Daleks, and the Master, you know, they're all there. But in some episodes, the 7th Doctor, he takes on quote-unquote gods. And when we look at that term, if you look all the way back to the 4th Doctor, when he was in the story Pyramids of Mars and he took on the god, as it were, Sutekh, what they explain it as it's actually just an incredibly ancient alien race with powers so unbelievably massive that they could crush you just by looking at you. Well, in a lot of ways, the 7th Doctor takes on entities like this in multiple stories. He's really going up against incredibly powerful, ancient, evil opponents who have been, in some cases, around before time as a concept was even around, which is an interesting throwback to one particular story in the 5th Doctor. I believe it was called Enlightenment, where the 5th Doctor had faced off with a group of creatures who existed outside of the realm of time, and they kind of down-talked the 5th Doctor like, Lords of Time? Are there lords in such a small realm? So it's interesting when we look at the 7th Doctor. He takes on really big opponents. The ante's been up, his knowledge has increased, he has more grasp, he has more intelligence and wisdom than before. And like I said, towards the last 2 seasons specifically, things were starting to get a little bit better. But it was unfortunately too little, too late. Doctor Who was on its deathbed as it was. The companion that the 7th Doctor had, well, he had 2 companions. The first one was Mel. And I talked about her when I talked about the 6th Doctor. She is so bad. She is squeaky, high-pitched, annoying, horrible companion. And after the first season, she was gone. Whew, thank you. And so they introduced Ace. Ace was an interesting companion because she was more of a tomboy, into explosives, you know, wore that sort of leather, that 80s leather, 80s metal, 80s grunt, you know, just, and she had the big boom box. So very much an 80s kind of a companion. Ace didn't really wear skimpy clothing. Once again, she is a pretty Jane Plain. The difference between her and Mel is Ace wasn't annoying, and she didn't make you want to pull your eyes out and scream every time she opened her mouth. So Ace was definitely a step up when it came to companions. So props to that, especially her love of explosives. I think that really worked well with the Seventh Doctor. He was, he had all the knowledge and all that, but then Ace, she's into blowing things up and hitting things with baseball bats. So it's kind of good to see that dynamic back. So the Seventh Doctor overall, what's my opinion, is he's okay. Much like the Fifth and Sixth Doctor, I'm kind of neutral on it. So now that I've talked about every single old school Doctor, you now know what my favorite and, as it were, least favorite Doctors were. I really like the Third Doctor. Fourth Doctor's pretty good. Second Doctor's pretty good. The First, the Fifth, the Sixth, and the Seventh are okay. If I had to choose between those four, the one I dislike the most, I'd probably go with the First Doctor, just because, as I discussed previously, it's so hard to get into that old school stuff. It's really a challenge. Seventh Doctor, I don't really dislike him that much. I think he did a good job for what he had. It's just, at the time, things were really, unfortunately, at their end. And Doctor Who, we had to say our goodbyes after the Seventh Doctor. But it wasn't going to last forever. No. Doctor Who was still around in other ways. But before we get into that, we need to wrap up the Seventh Doctor. I'm going to make 3 recommendations. 3 seasons, 3 recommendations. The first story I'm going to recommend is Dragonfire. This is the last story that Mel appears in, and the first story that Ace appears in. And it's the only Doctor Who story that I would ever recommend that has Mel in it as a companion, because she is so mind-bogglingly terrible, horrible, and gut-wrenching. At least you get to see her on the way out. I wish they could have killed her off. That would have been great if there would have been like a torture scene where she died a horrible, slow, painful death. Ugh, that'd be the best episode ever. They didn't, unfortunately. So Dragonfire is kind of an interesting episode. You have a planet where one half is facing the sun all the time, the other half is kind of this frozen, super cold, crystal star base, and there's this maniacal, ancient ice dude who's held prisoner by this dragon robot. Kind of from a story standpoint, it works pretty well. It introduces Ace as a companion, although there is some pretty corny acting in it, to say the least. The next story I'm going to recommend is Remembrance of the Daleks. This is a good one overall. I think it tries to do new things with the Daleks, introducing heavy weapons Dalek, but it was still interesting to see them try something new, try something a little bit different. Another interesting thing is that they're dealing with the Hand of Omega, which is this sarcophagus ancient thing. Basically what Omega used to tame the black hole, if I'm not mistaken on my lore. I probably am. I think was a great episode. And then the last episode I'm going to recommend, the last story I'm going to recommend, ironically enough, is the final story of the Seventh Doctor, the last story of old school Doctor Who, titled Survival. In this story, the Doctor takes on his arch-nemesis, his rival, the Master. And it's the last story of old school Doctor Who, last story of the Seventh Doctor. It's good to have the Master back. And I gotta say, there's a couple reasons I like Survival. One of the reasons, the actor who played the Master at this time really, I think, dialed in his performance on the Master in this episode. In a lot of previous episodes, the Master, from the 5th, 6th, and 7th Doctor era especially, the Master was kind of corny, kind of cheesy. He had this grin, and he would do his laugh, "Oh, Doctor." He'd always have these convoluted, overly complex plans that just made no sense when you actually looked at them, massive plot holes. And it's unfortunate that they kind of did that with the Master a lot, but in Survival, it's not as bad. There's even one point in the story Survival where I think you get the most genuine, honest, and chilling dialogue that the Master really ever gives, where he's literally talking to himself in the mirror. Because in Survival, there's this force, not necessarily a disease, on this planet that takes you over and turns you into an animal. And so the Master is trying to escape the planet, because the more you fight on the planet, the more the planet goes to its end to explode and to die. And so they got to get off, they got to get out of there. But when you watch this scene when the Master's talking to himself in the mirror, it's such a great scene. I really can't emphasize it enough, where he really gets into the fact that he is an ancient Time Lord. You got to remember, when the Doctor first met the Master was on his final regeneration. So you might ask, well, why is the Master still around? Well, the Master has cheated death time and time again. He is ancient. He is old. He's much older, I think, than most Time Lords, and technically you can't back that up with actual stories from the Doctor Who mythos or universe, but that's just something I think personally. So it's a pretty good episode overall. It's the end of old school Doctor Who. Oh, old school Doctor Who. You know, it's sad to see it go out like this, to see it end like that. Seventh Doctor, and then no more. Or is there more? Oh, well, we all know there is. But it might not be what you think. This is Cold Turkey. Thanks for watching.